They thought the war was oceans away. They thought America's last frontier was untouchable. But in 1942, the rising sun of Japan cast its shadow over Alaska, and the forgotten chain of islands at the edge of the world was about to become a battlefield. Now picture the Aleutians, an endless sweep of volcanic peaks and fog-bound cliffs, battered by wind and rain that could strip the paint from steel. Few Americans even knew where they were on a map. Remote, isolated, frozen. But to military minds, these islands weren't just barren rock. They were the stepping stones of the North Pacific. Whoever controlled them could threaten supply lines, launch bombing raids, and even use them as a springboard toward North America itself. In 1942, Alaska was barely defended. The U.S. was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, pouring resources into Hawaii, the Pacific Islands, and Europe. The Aleutians were an afterthought. Garrisons scattered, airfields half-built, and equipment rusting in the constant damp. Yet some visionaries warned of danger. As early as the 1930s, strategists noted that Japan's growing empire and proximity to Alaska posed a silent threat. If Tokyo struck north, America's back door would be wide open. For the Aleut people, the native inhabitants whose villages dotted the coasts, life went on as it had for centuries. They fished, hunted, and raised families against the roar of the sea. They were far from Washington's war planning, far from Tokyo's ambitions. To them, war was a distant storm. They could not know that within months, foreign boots would march on their soil, families would be torn from their homes, and their peaceful islands would become the stage for America's last battle on home ground. The table was set. Alaska stood as both shield and weak spot, forgotten by many but vital to the fate of the Pacific. And soon, the quiet mist of the Aleutians would be pierced by the scream of enemy aircraft. June 3rd, 1942.
Preparing was set by their enemy for June 3, 1942. The Japanese raid on Dutch Harbor was part of a larger plan to finish off the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Midway.
A naval base of Dutch Harbor awoke to a sound that would change history. The scream of engines cutting through thick Aleutian fog. Out of the low clouds came Japanese carrier planes, their wings heavy with bombs. The first explosions shattered the stillness. Oil tanks ignited in towering infernos, barracks splintered into burning wreckage, and warehouses erupted in flame. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians scrambled for cover as chaos tore through the base. Hospital staff rushed to evacuate the wounded as fire rained down. One eyewitness later recalled the shock of seeing the base hospital itself reduced to rubble, its walls collapsing in flames. Anti-aircraft guns barked back desperately, their tracers stitching the sky, but the attackers returned again and again. Smoke turned the morning into a choking darkness. By the end of the raid, dozens were dead and the port lay scarred and burning. The raid on Dutch Harbor wasn't just destruction, it was a message. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, enemy aircraft had struck American soil itself. The shock rippled across the United States. Radio broadcasts told of bombs falling on Alaska, and for many Americans, it felt as though the war had finally reached their own doorsteps. The myth of distance, the belief that the Pacific Ocean was a shield, shattered in a single morning. For Japan, Dutch Harbor was only the beginning. The attack was meant to distract the U.S. from Midway, to sow panic and confusion. But it also opened the door to something far more shocking: the invasion of American soil. Just days after Dutch Harbor burned, Japanese troops stepped ashore on two remote islands, Attu and Kiska. It was a moment that stunned the world. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign forces occupied American territory. What had once seemed unthinkable was now reality. Enemy soldiers were living, digging, and fortifying on U.S. soil. On Attu, the tiny Aleut village was seized almost immediately. Families who had lived on the windswept island for generations were torn from their homes, rounded up by soldiers with bayonets, and forced onto ships. Many were shipped overseas to Japan itself, imprisoned in camps where disease and starvation claimed lives. Back in the States, the news was devastating. Newspapers screamed the headlines, "Japanese invade Alaska." Panic swept through the West Coast. Ordinary Americans suddenly asked, could San Francisco be next? Could Seattle fall? For Japan, the occupation was both symbolic and strategic. Attu and Kiska, though barren and remote, gave them a foothold inside the American frontier. They built bunkers, dug tunnels, and laid mines across the rocky slopes. The Japanese flag now flew over American land, a propaganda victory that Tokyo boasted about to its people. For the United States, the humiliation was profound. Leaders in Washington knew they had to respond, but the harsh Aleutian climate and distance from supply lines made immediate action nearly impossible. Instead, for months, the islands remained in enemy hands, an open wound and a reminder that America's homeland was no longer untouchable. The battle for Alaska quickly froze, literally. From mid-1942 to mid-1943, U.S. and Japanese troops endured a year-long stalemate, not defined by bullets, but by the brutal environment. The Aleutians were no ordinary battlefield. Blizzards howled with hurricane-force winds. Fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead rolled in without warning. Soldiers dug trenches only to see them fill with icy water. Frostbite gnawed at hands and feet. Rifles jammed with ice. Boots rotted from weeks in mud and sleet. Men on both sides described it as fighting on the edge of the world. Isolation was crushing. Supplies struggled to arrive over stormy seas and primitive airfields. Food often froze solid before it could be eaten. Letters from home took months to arrive, if they came at all. Many soldiers wrote in diaries that the weather was their true enemy, not the opposing army. But even amid the misery, both sides prepared. Japanese engineers built reinforced bunkers into cliffs, creating hidden fortresses. American forces expanded bases on nearby islands, carving runways from tundra, and shipping in thousands of troops. Patrols clashed occasionally in fog-bound skirmishes, but most deaths came from the cold, disease, or exhaustion. For nearly a year, the Aleutians became a frozen no-man's land. Both armies endured, waiting for the next move. And all the while, the people of the United States held their breath, knowing that on a chain of forgotten islands, the war for their own soil had stalled, but was far from over. While soldiers endured the frozen hell of the Aleutians, the quiet suffering of civilians told another story. For the Aleut people, the war wasn't just a distant thunder. They were caught in the crossfire of two empires. When Japanese forces seized Attu, the native villagers, men, women, and children, were rounded up at bayonet point. Families who had lived in harmony with the harsh land for centuries were packed onto ships and sent across the Pacific. Many ended up in Japanese prison camps, where disease, starvation, and neglect claimed dozens of lives. Few ever returned home. On the American side, fear of invasion led to a decision that scarred generations. The U.S. government forcibly evacuated Aleut communities from other islands, shipping hundreds of people to relocation camps in southeast Alaska. Promised safety, they instead found themselves in abandoned canneries and makeshift shelters, with little food, inadequate heating, and rampant illness. Old men and children died by the dozens. For many survivors, the loss was not only of loved ones, but also of villages, traditions, and sacred places left behind to decay. Meanwhile, American civilians at Dutch Harbor and surrounding outposts lived under the constant threat of another raid. Families watched skies with dread, prepared to rush into bunkers at the sound of air raid sirens. Teachers tried to calm children as blackouts and air raid drills became routine. The Aleutian campaign wasn't just about soldiers and strategy. It was also about families uprooted, cultures shattered, and innocent people paying the price for geography. To this day, many Aleut survivors call it the lost time, a period when their homes and heritage were sacrificed in the name of defense. By early 1943, the humiliation of having enemy troops on U.S. soil could no longer be tolerated. Washington demanded action. Generals and admirals planned the largest military operation ever mounted in the North Pacific. But before America could strike back, it had to conquer an even deadlier enemy, the Aleutian wilderness itself. Engineers carved airfields out of tundra, fighting snow, rock, and mud. Construction crews battled hurricane-force winds while piecing together metal runways that would sink into the permafrost. Supply ships crept across treacherous seas, stalked by Japanese submarines and battered by storms. Every inch of preparation felt like war against nature. Meanwhile, troops trained for conditions unlike anything they had known. Rifles froze solid in sleet. Helmets iced over. Soldiers wrapped themselves in layers of wool, only to be soaked through minutes later by freezing rain. The Army quickly realized it wasn't enough to send men. It had to retool entire units for Arctic survival. At the same time, intelligence officers pieced together a clearer picture of Japanese defenses. Reconnaissance flights mapped bunkers, while codebreakers intercepted messages. The Japanese garrison on Attu was estimated at around 2,500 men. Hardened troops dug deep into the island's frozen ridges. The operation was codenamed Land Crab. Its objective, land on Attu, destroy the garrison, and reclaim American soil. The stakes were high. Failure would embolden the Japanese, proving they could not only raid but also hold U.S. territory. Success, however, would show the world that America would fight to the ends of the earth to defend its land. May 11, 1943. The invasion of Attu begins. U.S. troops, bundled in cold weather gear, step off landing craft into icy surf. At first, silence greets them. No Japanese defenders appear. The fog is so thick it swallows entire units, and the soldiers begin to wonder if the island has been abandoned. But within hours, sniper fire cracks through the mist, then mortars. The Japanese are there, hidden in ridges and ravines, waiting. What follows is one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War. Unlike the palm-fringed islands of the South Pacific, Attu is barren, freezing, and treacherous. Soldiers slog knee-deep in mud, climb slippery slopes, and collapse from exhaustion as they fight through sleet and snow. Many are struck not by bullets, but by frostbite, exposure, and trench foot. Some die in their sleeping bags, unable to withstand the cold. The Japanese defenders, commanded by Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, use the terrain masterfully. They vanish into caves and reappear behind advancing Americans. Every ravine becomes a death trap. Each hill has to be taken inch by inch, often with bayonets, grenades, or flamethrowers. American troops later described Attu as a battle against the island itself. One GI recalled crawling forward through fog so thick he could barely see the man beside him, firing into shadows and waiting for shapes to move. Casualties mounted by the hundreds, but slowly, painfully, the Americans inched forward. For the first time in over a century, U.S. soldiers were locked in a pitched battle on American soil. And as the fog closed in, the cost of reclaiming Attu was only beginning to reveal itself. By late May 1943, the Americans had pushed the Japanese into a shrinking pocket on Attu. But Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, commanding the garrison, refused to surrender. He knew his men were doomed, but he was determined to die in a blaze of honor. On the night of May 29th, shrouded in fog and desperation, he prepared his men for one final act, a banzai charge. At dawn, more than 800 Japanese soldiers surged out of their positions, screaming battle cries that shattered the misty silence. They smashed into U.S. lines at Engineer Hill, overwhelming aid stations and catching clerks, cooks, and medics completely off guard. Men who had never fired a shot in anger suddenly found themselves in hand-to-hand combat, swinging rifles like clubs, stabbing with bayonets, fighting for their lives against a tidal wave of desperate attackers. The Japanese cut through the first American positions with shocking speed. They bayoneted wounded men in their stretchers, overran command posts, and threw grenades into bunkers. For hours, chaos reigned. The defenders were driven back, fragmented, and nearly broken. But as the charge lost momentum, U.S. soldiers regrouped. Reinforcements poured in, and machine guns finally cut down the attackers in a storm of fire. When the smoke cleared, almost every Japanese soldier lay dead. Only a handful were taken prisoner. Yamasaki himself fell leading the charge, sword in hand. The Americans, stunned and shaken, had survived, but at a staggering cost. More than 500 U.S. casualties came in that single attack. It was one of the largest banzai charges of the war, and it marked the grim climax of the Aleutian campaign. Attu was secured, but the ground was soaked with blood, proof that reclaiming American soil would be anything but easy. With Attu retaken, attention turned to Kiska, the second occupied island. By July 1943, intelligence suggested the Japanese garrison still numbered several thousand. Plans were drawn for another massive assault, codenamed Operation Cottage. Tens of thousands of U.S. and Canadian troops prepared to storm ashore, braced for another battle as savage as Attu. On August 15th, 1943, under cover of fog, the landings began. Soldiers crept through the mist, rifles ready, nerves on edge. They expected snipers behind every ridge, machine guns hidden in bunkers, artillery waiting to blast the beaches. But the silence was uncanny. No shots rang out. No resistance came. Slowly, the truth emerged. The Japanese were gone. Under cover of fog weeks earlier, their navy had evacuated the garrison without being detected. But the danger wasn't over. The island was riddled with booby traps, mines, and abandoned equipment. Confused units stumbled into each other in the fog, mistaking friends for enemies. In the chaos, dozens of soldiers were killed in accidental firefights, friendly fire claiming more lives than the Japanese had in their retreat. For the men on Kiska, the anticlimax was surreal. They had trained, prepared, and braced for carnage, only to find empty bunkers and ghostly silence. Still, casualties were real, and the cost of taking back Alaska was carved into history. Operation Cottage ended without a true battle, but with a reminder that even victory could come with bitter irony. With Attu and Kiska back in Allied hands, the Aleutian campaign was officially over. But the cost was heavy. Nearly 4,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing. Many victims not just of combat, but of frostbite, disease, and exposure. For the Japanese, the losses were devastating. Almost the entire garrison of Attu wiped out in a suicidal charge, and hundreds more lost during the evacuation of Kiska. For the Aleut people, the war left scars that would never fully heal. Entire villages were destroyed. Families never came home. Survivors returned to find homes looted or burned, sacred sites defiled, and cultures fractured. Generations later, the pain of displacement and exile remains a living memory. Strategically, the campaign proved America's resolve. It showed the world that the U.S. would defend its territory no matter how remote, no matter how hostile the terrain. The hard lessons learned about Arctic warfare, survival in extreme conditions, and the necessity of proper training would shape later operations in colder climates. And yet, the Aleutian campaign faded into history's shadows, overshadowed by Normandy, by the Pacific island hopping, by larger and bloodier battles. It became known as the Forgotten Battle. But for those who fought there, for those who froze, bled, and died on those islands, it was unforgettable. Today, rusting weapons, shattered bunkers, and ghostly remnants still dot the Aleutians. Winds howl over empty ridges where men once fought and fell. And in that lonely landscape, the memory lingers. The last time foreign troops stood on U.S. soil, and the last battle fought to take it back.